Okay, so we are going to continue here with Proverbs chapter 17. This is part 2. We are on verse 8. A gift is as a precious stone in the eyes of him that has it. Whithersoever it turneth, it prospereth. Now the primary axis of this verse is within the word gift. Everything else turns on it. It's dependent upon understanding gift. Now, precious stone in the eyes of him that has it. This is our analogy, our metaphor. And no matter what direction it faces, it prospers, it increases. So to understand everything downstream, we need to understand the nature of the gift. And what we're left with is something vague, just a gift. It's something that can be given by one person to another, by God to a man. It is something that can be found. It is something that could be perhaps in all of these analogies and all of these attempted definitions, I think that there is a commonality. That any possible way in which something can be given is something that can be considered a gift. Within the auspices of ownership that dwells within this word giving, by extension of our reflection on the word giving, we move outward to seek what actually is occurring when the event of somebody gives something willingly without want or desire of some payment in return. A gift is a sacrifice. It is the development of a relation, of a connection. For within the sacrifice, something is given up. Perhaps it's given laterally or giving straight up to the heavenly source. And within this sacrifice, what we are establishing is a relationship. And within the relationship, we are creating the infrastructure that is possible to carry this truth and understanding. And it is by this carrying of truth and understanding that wherever this precious stone or this gift turns in the hands of him that has it will increase, because it is by the road by which truth and understanding traverse. So prospering could be in the yield of one's harvest. It could be within the relationship of within one's families. Now I'll have to admit that I think that there is some incoherence in that interpretation. And there is a general thread, perhaps something that is useful. But at this moment I think it's best to move on. He that covers a transgression seeks love, but he that repeats a matter separates very friends. Now our primary word of concern here is cover. And I say that because in the first instance, if we cover something, it is, in the modern parlance, to obscure it. And I think if we went by this meaning, he that obscures a transgression or hides it, we could say, seeks love, would not really make sense. So there must be some other way by which we should understand the word cover. Now, another way in which we use the word cover is to lay something out, It is to describe. Another way we can say cover is to go over. Now the imagery is similar, that of covering something for obscurity's sake, but also to cover something to walk its expanse, to identify its boundaries. Again, to describe this thing, to describe this transgression that we might imagine upon some landscape as this divot in the earth, a divot caused by some violent impact, some violent insult to the surface that would otherwise remain unbroken. And this transgression, of course, is the breaking of the law. Now, of what law? It could be of any law. It could be the law of man or the law of God. It could be the law that is established, the rules that we can say that are established, certainly beneath the divine order, but rules nonetheless that each relationship or a family has. Many laws are unspoken. Many laws are set to define boundaries. And I think that when an insult occurs, when a transgression occurs, the boundary has been crossed. Hence the trans portion of that word. Now, gress it means to step or to walk. Now, this is exactly our original illustration. The etymology of this word fits quite well. That again, it is this crossing or moving beyond by way of stepping or walking. It is to move across this boundary. Now, it's quite interesting that a person that seeks love is going to cover this transgression. Again, not in the way of security, but in the way of identification and thereby reestablishment, perhaps. And I think that we have to think that within this crater, upon the landscape that has been produced by this transgression, again, we can expand our mind to think beyond just the material landscape, although physical examples are quite easy to imagine, but also the insult to the heart, the betrayal, perhaps, that one can inflict upon another, that between two parties they are in some relation, or any particular example that comes to mind that fits this pattern. It's interesting and it's necessary to consider exactly what it is about the seeking love that causes one to explore the transgression, to understand what unfortunate step, what boundary had been insulted. And it's, by extension, I think, interesting to imagine the effect that love would have on such a process, that is, the process of covering a transgression. Because in some sense it means to relive that event, because if you are going to cover something, to describe it, to flesh it out in its entirety, it is to explicitly identify that which had been, some behavior had been falsely committed, whether under the pretense of will or by some mistaken nature, by some mistaken behavior. So now let's say we have established this identity, the identity of the transgression. We have covered the transgression. Now we have done so out of seeking, out of an attempt to find something. Now what we are looking for must be quite a gem if we are willing to go back into that transgression, that space that often produces a lot of pain, especially if we are talking about some insult between two individuals, especially between two individuals that might care about each other and might have love for one another. Such transgressions and the crossings of certain boundaries can be devastating. And now in some sense, this seeking, this attempting to find something, can be, to a degree, a reestablishment, as I've mentioned, of some love that was lost. But let's say for a moment that there has been a transgression, a breach of some law or some boundary, upon which there was no profound sense of love. How then would a man even approach this problem? Well, I think in the first instance, he would have to have a degree of self-awareness and an orientation of mind that sees beyond his own selfish desire. That would be number one. Number two, in his striving and in his seeking, he must be seeking something that is beyond himself. That's kind of similar to that selfish desire, but seeking beyond himself, seeking love, seeking the true way of things, that since he had transgressed, perhaps he is interested in identifying the nature of this transgression, if it was true, in the sense that what had come down to him, perhaps from the community, let's say, was justified, or rather that this transgression was falsely attributed to him. Now it could be the other way as well, that someone that wishes to understand the nature of their transgression, perhaps on their understanding that their own fault, and accepting the judgment by the community. They wish to seek this boundary and rectify. But what I'm after here is exactly how this love works in this circumstance, because we have identified that this issue, regardless of its condition, there may be varying degrees of severity, varying degrees of salience for which one might want to or wish to cover a transgression. Surely a faithful person, a righteous person, ought to want to cover every transgression. But again, it is easier, it is more salient when the transgressions are quite severe and the boundaries that have been broken are quite firm and established. And so the question is it possible that this thing that we call love, within part of its definition, within its meaning, lies the very framework of, now this is difficult to say because it's quite expansive. In my mind, I think of the boundaries that exist between individuals, the boundaries that exist around each and every one of us as an individual, the boundaries that surround our relationships, the boundaries that surround our responsibilities in life, the boundaries that surround our relationship to God, the boundaries that surround our relationship to the world. Much of these boundaries are beyond the explicit understanding, and even if they are implicit, what goes beyond, that there are rules, that there are boundaries, there are laws, by which man has no idea, and yet he participates within this frame, within this environment that he finds himself in. It is as much a physical set of boundaries as it is a spiritual, metaphysical, conscious one. And in both instances, one is no less true than the other. Now, of course, given man's frailty, given his fallen nature, he can be mistaken, no doubt. But given the action in that sphere, in that conscious sphere, the boundaries exist. He can just as easily violate some physical boundary by which he makes some poor judgment and suffers some self-injury or transgression. There are boundaries that exist between us and ourselves, as strange as that might seem, that there is this identification of us that sees above the whole of us, and yet is us, that thing of the self that can see itself. There are boundaries by which that subject have with the rest of the self, of the being self, perhaps we can call it, the self that exists, unbothered by the judging, the looking down part of the individual, if any of that makes sense. And I think it's interesting the way in which this directed portion of the self, that the king, the crown that is placed upon this part of the self, let's say, the way in which it can understand something, it can understand boundaries, it can understand the concept of transgression, what it means to cover it, the role of love, perhaps that this love plays in the reestablishment of boundary, or without the context of transgression and covering that transgression is part of the boundary in and of itself. It is interesting how the self can find itself so abstracted and outside of its own desire to do good that it would seem, this is this is sort of a tongue-in-cheek sort of conclusion that I'm coming to here. Tongue-in-cheek because it it is so colloquial that it almost goes without saying, that the transgressions that the self engages in, regardless of his understanding of the truth, is seemingly beyond the self. It is an influence of something else. It is the influence of some source of intelligibility, perhaps, or some way of being that exists within the Platonic realm of forms that comes down and influences his behavior, that tempts him away, this perennial temptation that is prompted by that of what we might call the evil spirit, the devil. That whatever way in which the spirit moves in relation to the conscious experience of man is difficult to say, but anyway, that reflection, I think, is interesting, because throughout my life I've experienced periods of this in which this thing can come in that seemingly convinces my directed self against that which it already understands. And I'd like to dwell for a moment on the nature of identification. Perhaps of identity, but both, I think, are related in this reflection. That this identification, in our experience, when we identify something, we give it, rather we observe, we can attribute to Certainly we do both. We can observe the boundaries. We identify the things by which we are able to identify something as separate from other things. We do so by second nature. Now, the identification of these things that separate some things from different things from other things, like, for example, the book in front of me is quite different than from the microphone in front of my face. The word here, chapter 17, is quite different from chapter 18. It is separated by some boundary, in the Proverbs perhaps by not a great degree as perhaps a novel, which would have their own distinct character, but they are separate nonetheless by form, and perhaps by meaning. Is difficult to say since we are not in chapter 18 yet. But regardless of all of those specificities and particulars, the point is that we are able to identify things from other things. Now, this analogy is simple enough when I'm talking about objects, when I'm talking about tangible things, things that don't really require much second-guessing, patterns that are easy to identify because of their concreteness, things by which we are fairly confident that this is something not unique to our experience, but also if somebody else were to come into thought with us and explore certain objects that are before us, we'd probably be able to identify everything similarly. And yet, if we rise up through the layers of intelligibility and we find ourselves in the conscious sphere, we find ourselves in this sphere of complex relation between neurons, complex relation between organic molecules, between different life forms. And given all of these various gradations, and I should mention before I continue, we can extend this to the immaterial, or the material rather, that is beyond that of life, that even material structure can have relationships to other material things, bound within some expanse of law and boundary. But back to the point about narrowing down to this strange experience that we all have, this conscious experience. And what's even stranger within our conscious experience is how difficult the identification of certain patterns become. And yet they are as real to us as the book or the microphone that's in front of me that would be easily identified. And anybody that is engaged in a certain type of relationship will be able to experience and identify love, identify characteristics of it that are common between people that they observe and that they feel. It is not just a feeling. The heart, obviously, is an important organ in the meaning sense to the identification of pattern, as is the conscious directed mind. But this identification, this ability that we have to confidently say that this exists, and it exists, it has an existence of its own, an identity of its own. And if we are indeed to say that within the perceptual layers, the perceptual spheres, when we move wherever we wish to move, if we move far enough outside of the human experience, outside of the bells and whistles that the human being has to interpret a certain layer of reality. If we choose to move into the sphere of sound, there is an experience within our range of perceptibility beyond which we cannot perceive. The same with vision. The same with all sorts of different perceptual capabilities. And the same is true of the identification of patterns, the identification of relationships between things, and also the heavenly aspects of reality that we seem so flippant about in the modern day. That perhaps because many of us believe that we live within a soup of relativism, that the real things really are only the immaterial, and not which that gives man meaning and purpose. But my broader point is this capability of ours to identify the patterns, certainly in the material world, that are observable are a pillar of truth. Now these pillars of truths extend, surely, into our experience, into our identification of love, into our identification of one another, of the selves. Into the identification of the thinking realm. For surely we can identify patterns among organic beings that do not communicate in the same way that we do, and yet there is a pattern of behavior that is recognizable, it is intelligible, it is identifiable. Our experience of interaction is no less identifiable than some pattern that is less complex. And if we move above us in that perceptual sphere, no less is true of that being. And as we move all the way up until we find ourselves at the top of this expanse, we find ourselves within this dome of intelligibility, outside of which is perhaps the source of that intelligibility. For I'm not sure exactly what it would mean to peer outside of the space that is intelligible. Perhaps I have this vision in my mind of the sphere that transcends the experience of man, an experience that transcends the limited perceptual capacity, the localization of his experience, the limited nature that the self is in relation to the body, his limited experience in terms of his physical existence on a particular piece of the earth, and a particular planet, and a particular solar system, and a particular galaxy. If we imagine how limited his experience is, we can appreciate the possibility for how expansive other beings with other perceptual capabilities are. And if we imagine the pinnacle of all of it, the union of that intelligible thing, that intelligible source and sphere, there is a condition, there is a circumstance in which all is known. And within the realm of ethics and morality, it's quite a bizarre, interestingly poetic and rigidly, I don't want to say scientific, but to a degree, there is procedure involved. But it is, as I imagine our own experience, at least the possibility of one's experience to maximize their experience, is quite profound. And to see that beyond, which is the mind that sees, becoming part of the mind that sees, and understanding our relationship to that thing, while also understanding that we have a will of our own, is a trip to think about. It's difficult to conceptualize. But we get to this place out of the original point of this verse here. It's, he that covers the transgression seeketh love, but he that repeats a matter separates very friends. What this conversation came from was that of love. What I originally intended was to explore the identity of love. But of course, when we explore identity, we explore perception. We explore the truthfulness of the things that bind things together, whether earthly or heavenly. We sort of walk down that path of this expansive consciousness, some source of intelligibility, as I've said. And the main point that I wanted to reach here was that given all of our experience, given all of our confidence in life, if we think about the things that we are most confident in, the things that we can most surely identify, we are left with this unfortunate conventionalism. We are left with the super-relativism that, of course, is not the whole of reality or of existence by any stretch of the imagination, but because of man's fallen nature, because of his susceptibility to temptation and all of the perennial desires, because he is able to be corrupted, he's able to be mistaken in terms of the patterns that he identifies in reality, and thereby he can be mistaken in identifying different identities. Moreover, from that, given that as sort of a backdrop, given the things that we can identify, zoom out from the things that we are most confident in, and then imagine the things that are a bit fuzzy, like a very pixelated image. Perhaps we can make out in general what the image is. We can understand the silhouette of a person, even if it's extremely pixelated. We don't understand. We can't identify the facial features. Perhaps we can't even identify the gender. But if we zoom out enough, we could see the individual. Perhaps we can even see what they're doing. Perhaps they're playing with their pet dog or something. Perhaps they're driving to work, whatever it might be. I have to imagine that, to a certain degree, I think love and all of its expansiveness falls in this category. You know, there are things about it that are surely identifiable. We can identify the person, and yet of the person we have no knowledge. The specifics we know nothing of. That is beyond our ability to perceive because of the way that it comes to us. Now I think if we stopped there, if we ended at that place in mind, I think it would be quite unfortunate. Now I think that there are inherent limitations to man's abilities, but certainly we are also capable of transcendence. We have an individual will to do so. And there are unfortunate realities, unfortunate in relation to the mind that wishes to know everything. So perhaps my hubristic mind. The unfortunate realities is the limitations of mind, the limitations of my average intelligence, but also the limitations of those less fortunate, of those who are born into minds, bodies that experience much less than the average. Certainly they are no less in terms of the ethical standard, the moral standard, but the experience made more difficult, the possibility of transcendence more problematic. But we ought not to let the postmodern sensibility ruin our fun here. If we just focus on who we are, what we have, be thankful for it, identify that transcendence is possible, I think there's a lot of interesting experience to be had in the process of becoming, both in the Platonic sense, but also in the sense of transformation, in the sense of covering our transgressions and seeking love. Now, by that token, this next verse I think is in direct relation. A reproof enters more into a wise man than 100 stripes into a fool. Now, we've been speaking of covering of transgressions. We've been thinking of the fuzziness of the boundaries, which boundaries are laden with truthfulness, which is related in some degree, if not directly equivalent to love. We talked about the possibility of the transcendence of man. And now here we see a wise man, a man that has reached a level in which he understands that reproof is important for him to identify that transgression. For if he identifies that transgression, he understands the relationships, he's better able to identify patterns in the world, both heavenly and earthly. And since he is capable of such a thing, and since he is oriented, and since he lives such a way willfully, this comes down to him more easily. It is the catcher's mitt of the divine instruction. That is what the wise man has. A reproof enters more into a wise man than 100 stripes into a fool. Now, 100 stripes, I think here of whipping, of a punishment. And certainly the stripes is a form of reproof, but this mode, this method, this person does not choose to accept, does not choose to take those steps. That's a common language, interesting to see it here in this, emerge in this verse, to take the steps towards transcendence, to take the steps to achieve blah blah blah. This is something that surely many of us repeat to ourselves in life, or have heard repeated to us by friends or family or loved ones, An evil man seeks only rebellion. Therefore a cruel messenger shall be sent against him. Now here when I read this, I see language that surely was the primary mode of interpretation of identification. And I also see a man of a certain age that is attempting to understand exactly what the people that wrote, the people that were inspired by, that which was surely true to them, meant by the language that they used. Now, it's not entirely difficult to understand some modern conception of evil, or some conception of rebellion. And perhaps this is a bit too harsh of a critique on the self. It ought not to be much of a critique on the self, rather than that of an opportunity to understand a way of thinking and a pattern that occurs and is not dependent on any particular age. More and more so in the modern era, whatever we call this age now, postmodern. This contemporary era, we can call it, is marked by this rapid technological advancement, globalization, digitization. That, in a bizarre sense, it seems like we are witnessing the creation of a heavenly type sphere, a digital heavenly sphere. And now it doesn't mean it's going to be good. It doesn't mean that we won't be tempted into a polytheistic way of viewing things, worship idols and all the rest. But in terms of transcendence, it seems as though we are entering into a new phase of philosophical understanding. We're moving away more and more so, thankfully, from that of the postmodern era, that everything is viewed as highly subjective, constructed, everything is relative. We wish to destruct things and blur the boundaries between things. Obviously it cannot stand. Truth cannot survive in such a hostile environment. Or I should say, surely truth will survive, but man will not. His life will become too meaningless and too purposeless to continue. And so we see an evil man seeks only rebellion. Now, rebellion we've sort of defined in our meandering way, but it does have to some degree, it relates to this idea of boundaries. What we are rebelling against is some standard that we feel to be unjust. Now, the process by which we come to justice is fraught with difficulties, no doubt, and surely it frustrates many that lose faith in the way that things are done. Perhaps they lose faith in justice altogether, that everything just seems to be so impossible, so relative, that the only thing that could stand, the only thing that can exist, is the opinion of the person at the top. I have to wonder, surely this type of person that seeks only rebellion is the evil person. They seek power. They are stuck in that relativistic soup, and they can't see beyond it. They can't convince themselves of a world that is ordered, that is purposeful, and that there actually is a way to truth, as difficult as it might seem as we transcend the layers, as we want more and more justice for ourselves. This seems to be our exploration seems to be more and more obscured by the levels that we transcend. And this is more complicated by the retreating coastline that was once our firmly held beliefs. Not that everything is now completely relative, but it is a period of confusion, uncertainty, insecurity, in those principles once held. Now, of course, there is something to be said about obscurity. When one has established something to sustain them on a long journey, perhaps a house they built for themselves where they could stay, perhaps to last out the winter. And when the winter passes and the flowers begin to bloom and the weather becomes more tolerable for a journey, we set out again. And what once had sustained us no longer sustains us, because it is ever increasingly in our rear view. And if we fail to reestablish ourselves, to continually go on the hunt, to keep ourselves hydrated, to nourish ourselves, to reorient ourselves to the direction that we are moving and the map that we have, if we fail to understand this journey that we're on, that it should and ought to be the journey towards truth. The end goal, ideally, would be the transcendent cabin, in which there is something that we always are secure in. And perhaps it seems like up until a certain period we had a bit of this, and then just like an earthquake shakes the earth, disturbs its foundations, something similar happened in the spiritual realm of man. But it's also exciting. This is where we're at now in the modern day, the contemporary era, the postmodern era. So strange. I would have to hope that there is somebody that takes care in the future to examine exactly what happened here, to find the voices of this day, where it is now currently late September 2023, and to recover the experience that we all had. That no matter how far man walks into the future, no matter how far time leaves my voice behind, that since it is here, since that it is recorded, it is of something that will always be recognizable to the human form, regardless of how many steps he has walked up or that he has fallen back down. He will recognize it. He will see his own experience in it. Now this cruel messenger shall be sent against him. This is a prophetic token. This is a message of what is to come. Interesting how man is able to see such things. It's vague enough to be able to identify a broad pattern, but of course not resolute enough to identify the particulars. But again, as we live through this age, I think this becomes more and more clear, this cruel messenger. And that we would have to hope within the mind of man in this age that we do not forget how to describe this thing that comes to us, this cruel messenger. One of the negative consequences of relativism and destructivism, the blurring of boundaries, is it makes it difficult to identify the cruel messenger when it comes. And what we ought to do to change, to keep that messenger at bay. Let a bear, robbed of her whelps, meet a man rather than a fool in his folly. The illustrations in the Proverbs are quite interesting at times. this verse, it's difficult, again, at the outset to understand what it's trying to get at. Because why the image of a bear? How is it robbed? And why would it rather meet a man than a fool? For in the first instance we have an animal that is a predator, a bear, that perhaps would otherwise mean this man harm. But there has been an injustice done to this bear, to this predator of the animal kingdom. The injustice is that she was robbed of her young. And there seems to suggest that within this sphere, within this context, if this bear were to meet the man, then somehow there would be a rectification, a lessening of the injustice that was done to this animal. And if the bear had come across a fool that was sort of wallowing in his own silliness and whatever else a fool might wallow in, inattentiveness, then the bear, upon meeting this fool, would not be resolved, that there would be not enough care or focus to rectify the situation. So this is our rough scaffolding of interpretation for this verse. But why use the image of the bear? And why transpose or translate that of the man? And then contrast that with another example of man. Surely this verse would still stand if we said, let a woman robbed of her children meet a man rather than a fool in his folly. This proverb would continue in its truthfulness. And yet this is not what is written. It explicitly says, a bear has been robbed of her whelps. And so I think it prompts us to imagine, to understand the position of the bear relative to man. Now, I started to describe this relationship, that we understand the bear to be a predator that feasts upon the prey, and man himself is not free from the tyranny of the bear. And yet, man, on the other hand, has a particular way of viewing the bear. The man is elevated in his understanding, in his ability to use devices for his own ends. The things that concern him, although similar to the bear, that of sustenance, that of survival, transcends that of the bear. Not that the bear has no familial ties, that there is no understanding of connection between the two animals, but rather, in the animalistic sense, it is reduced relative to the capacity of man. And that is not to say that man does not have the capacity for the utmost cruelty and injustice towards his own kin. But if we just think about it reasonably, the space of possibility, the opportunity that is afforded to each being, the man has much more of an opportunity to pursue things outside of the base instinctual level of existence. And in this way we see the relationship. In the best of man, he sees the misfortune in nature, the misfortune that cannot be rectified by the lowly beings that are the animals. Now it is better for this bear to meet the man because the man represents this, I guess we could say righteousness, this utmost man, this man that stands tall, the man that is able to raise the condition of the unfortunate, and to again rectify that of misfortune. The fool, on the other hand, is an inattentive person, easily deceived by base distractions. A foolish person is imprudent. They care not for the future. Perhaps they are, if they weren't so dim-witted or oriented towards silliness and perpetual lightheartedness, they would be on the road to wickedness and self-centeredness. But in the case of the fool, as he is drowning in his folly, there is no way that he would be able to help this bear that has been robbed of her whelps. And so of this verse, I think we can say a few things, a few conclusions we can draw. In the first instance, we can draw the existential conscious layer, the level of man's experience. And we can also draw from this everything that is below him, but also on the plane that is man, we see the potential conditions that for righteousness and transcendence, or for foolishness and a type of darkness, a sedimentation, a dullness of experience, similar to that of the animal, certainly not the same. And so what we are called to is the recognition not only to these levels, to these layers, but also of the righteous man and the righteous path who has the capacity to rectify misfortune, of the lower levels, and surely this would apply of the man to the fool in his folly, just as much as it does the man to the bear that has been robbed of her whelps. Now, of this rectification of misfortune, fortune in the context and in the sense that I mean it, is that it has to do with riches, it has to do with substance, it has to do with prosperity. This, of course, can include material prosperity, but this is quite superficial, it is quite base. What I mean of this substance, of this fortune, is the restoration of that which is meaningful, accompanied by a proper account of that which is true. Now that may sound like a bunch of nonsense, especially without a proper example. But I will say that of misfortune, if we can imagine fortune similar to the patterns that we just discussed before, that of some electrified boundary that is solidified by this word that we call love, that is difficult, almost intangible, but experienceable, and in language it seems to be fuzzy and vague, just like a irresolute image, or an image of low resolution. We have this fortune bound by these properties, and when we introduce an unfortunate circumstance or misfortune into the mix, what we see is an unraveling of those boundaries. And this type of transgression here is not able to be seen by the bear, nor is it able to be seen by the fool, for whatever reason. But it is able to be seen by the man. And it is only only by which the being that is able to see can that being solve the problems of others. Solve problems. Full stop. Whoso rewards evil for good, evil shall not depart from his house. Now, a relatively simple proverb, again, simple on the surface, but it may prompt us into a significant arena of growth. And so we must always pursue that of the seemingly believed to be known. And I think it is easy for myself to imagine good and evil as something that is territory much explored. But just like that of the category of love, it is a difficult thing, especially just isolated to the expression of speech, the expression of mind, without some embodied portion. So of evil, what can we say? Thus far I've been discussing evil as this sort of extension of wickedness, extension, of course, in the negative direction. Evil is the self-centeredness of an individual to such an extreme degree that even though they find themselves within that prison, they rob themselves of external input for their own creation, for their desire to have power over everything in their experience, for their belief that the reality that they inhabit is their reality, that the reality that they are thrown into is there for them to rule for their purposes. Now, a degree of that is true, but of their selfishness, they see nothing of the virtue that is that requires the sustenance that comes from without. And moreover from that, these people are, that of the evil, can be quite self-aware. That although they understand their relationship to the world, they still choose this path. They choose the evil path. They choose the path that is contrary, that wishes to seek destruction and unraveling for the sake of destruction and unraveling. Now, of course, if one is to inhabit such a place, and they spend their days unraveling everywhere they go, and destroying everywhere they go, it's no doubt that this is going to follow them home. It's going to follow them in their heart, in their minds, in their souls. Just as a fire burns in a fire pit, if we were to take all of that wood and place it indoors or someplace that we would rather not have a fire, it doesn't matter. That fire will still burn. The heat from that fire will still be experienced. Its destructive capacity will still be there. The beginning of strife is as when one letteth out water. Therefore, leave off contention before it be meddled with. Now, an interesting way of describing urination, letting out water. The beginning of strife is as when one lets out water. Now, what can we mean? What can be meant by this? We all have the experience of letting out water. But it's a strange thing, because it's one of relief. Now, strife is a negative thing. And we would think at the beginning of a negative thing, we would experience some negativity. Now, there are different paths that we can go here, but this is the first one that I think we ought to focus on. So, it is possible that, if this is to be true, that when we experience urination, and that initial moment when we have that relief, and we have that comfort and understanding that the uncomfortable feeling, sensation that the bladder is full will depart from us shortly, that perhaps at the beginning of strife the sensation is there in a deceptive manner. Now, strife is an interesting word. A literal definition is angry or bitter disagreement over fundamental issues, conflict. Now, I think it's worthwhile to talk a little bit more about this word, because just defining it is insufficient. Most words, just defining them to understand them, are insufficient. Now, if we are to expand on this strife in one of its dimensions, that of this disagreement, we can also imagine this as a disunity, that we have two fundamental pillars, two things that are known, and for some reason there's a disagreement between the two. Now, why there is a disagreement between the two, it's uncertain why that would be the case. It could be the failure of man to unite certain things about his world, about his being, about his self, his heart, that are so fundamental that they ought to be together, but for whatever reason, they become separated. Or it is the case that one pillar ought not to be a pillar of truth, while the other one should stand. Now, I think in such a situation, in which there is this conflict and this disagreement, and this separation, this friction between two things, or perhaps the strife that can lead to this separation, the initial identification of the problem, I think, perhaps could be relieving, because before the problem is made known, before the disagreement has been explicitly outlined, before it has been covered, just like in verse 9, he that covers a transgression seeks love. Before that, perhaps transgression is not the word that we ought to use, but certainly cover is a good word. Before these fundamental issues are covered in such a way that they are understood, and understood to both parties, in the sense that each party has chosen for themselves a reason for staying with that pillar of that foundation. And now, within the separation of something that was seemingly antagonistic, there must be a sense of relief in the same sense that there is a relief upon the initial act of voiding or urination, or letting out of water, as it says here. Now we could move further into the darkness, into this uncharted territory, and remove the pillars altogether. That a disagreement can cause such a profound sense of confusion, a lack of consensus, that there is, if we can imagine such a fundamental thing. I've been using the analogy of the mountain. At the peak of the mountain is this divine logos, this truthful pillar, the source of intelligibility. Imagine a scenario in which we can no longer agree on that central point. That central point, even if we don't understand the central point, we would imagine that at least admitting that the central point is worthwhile to be oriented towards and walking towards. The lack of consensus on that very direction, as fundamental as that might seem, but also strife implies fundamental issues. As fundamental as that is, we remain at the base of that mountain, and there comes that word, base, that sort of superficial sense. And there are many ways, there are many threads by which we can draw and connect the unfortunate nature that baseness brings to the condition of man. It reduces him. We saw it in the previous verse with the fool. We saw it in man's relation to the fool. We saw it in relation to the bear. There are certain base ways of being that are just fundamentally negative to man's experience and for his potential to transcend, to make progress with himself and with others within the society that he finds himself in. So we find ourselves here in this darkness and perhaps within the waters of confusion, the torrent that wipes things away. The beginning of strife is as when one letteth out water. Therefore, leave off contention before it be meddled with. Now what might that mean? Therefore, leave off contention. Well, we have to define contention. Now, contention is not dissimilar to that of strife. Contention is some heated disagreement, but here we see the similar word, disagreement. Now, contention may be an assertion, can be a proposed argument, but I don't think it would be wise to suggest that man ought not to contend with his fellow man. Contend in the sense to challenge him for purposes of finding the truth. Now, if one wishes to contend for the sake of his own good and for the sake of his own selfishness, then perhaps that's not the best way to go about things. And in such a case, or in all the gradations inferior to that in terms of the meaning sense, then that also must be true, even more so as we descend those gradations. The beginning of strife is as one letteth out water, therefore leave off contention before it be meddled with. Now another interesting step in this verse is the word meddled. It means to be sort of to tinker with, to adjust, to be manipulated. Now in this context, the context of manipulation, if we pair that with contention, we draw that parallel to strife, and we understand that within our disagreements, within our explicit understanding of things, it is often the case that we come to find some truth or some reason for which we can believe something to be true. It is a relief, just as, again, one letteth out water. However, within the context, again, and through the thread of the meddled contention, the strife that is produced between friends, between perhaps strangers, perhaps man and God, is to poke at, it is to intrude on something that would cause harm to the transjective, I'll say, the Vervaekian transjective. That is the thing that unites the inner self from the outside world. We might call it the binding force of love. We might call it the the highway of relatability between beings. And a big takeaway, I think, a big highlight here is that of discernment, because we can quickly see how fast the beginning of strife can devolve into such confusion and such chaotic darkness that has such dramatic negative effects on man's ordering of his life and of the society that he finds himself in, his city, his family. And so the discernment is where ought one be strategic? Where ought one to be discerning? Well, he ought to be discerning at the beginning of strife. He ought to be discerning in the moments that he finds relief in his separation from another person. For in that moment he ought to, I think, experience this as a temporary good, or a transitory good that leads into something else, a greater good. Now, this transitory good is the illumination of something that is recognizable, some pattern that is seen. It is not the case that we use this recognized pattern to be contentious for the sake of contention, or to meddle with that contention, as in the second half of the verse, to make it worse, to poke at it, but rather it is to be used so that we ourselves may test what we think we have found against another's realization, their beginning of their strife, so that we may do something productive together. And that is why we leave off contention before it is meddled with. Now, strife is fundamentally a negative word, so I may be putting the cart before the horse here. However, strife will occur in life. There's no escape from that. And if it does indeed occur, then I think that this is the best approach to mitigate what is mentioned in the second half of the verse. Leave off contention before it's meddled with, before it is interfered with, before the opportunity of mutual benefit has been closed, before the light has been extinguished. Now there's another road that we can go down here, the one that involves a different essence of strife. It focuses on the negative, perhaps, as it ought to focus on it, since it's in the nature of the word strife. It implies an anger within the disagreement. And when I said that I may have been putting the cart before the horse, that means to imply that I'm not recognizing the anger that already exists in that conversation, which may make the mutual benefit of that separation much more difficult. And in such a manner, in such an interpretation, we have to imagine, well then, how is this related to urination? Now, we may interpret this not from the experience of man, let's say, of his emotional response, or of his sensational response during this voiding or emptying of the bladder, in which case, from his perspective, perhaps that's not the right language to use, but from the sensation that he receives, the sort of embodied experience that is urination, it is a relieving type feeling. It is an emptying. But if we look at it from a different point of view, from perhaps top down, and we just imagine the analogy that this letting out of water is associated with the symbol of water that is something that has this destructive and yet renewing force, that it is impossible to control. You can't grasp onto it. You can touch it and you'll get wet, but you won't hold it. It'll flow past you. It'll flow beyond you. And I think in such a way, there is a relationship here between the impermanence of grasping the substance such as water and the impermanence of conflict resolution when the anger in that strife begins. That is to say, the anger in this strife is difficult to grasp, as water is difficult to grasp or to hold, and it can get out of control. And as we move into the second half of the verse, therefore, leave off contention before it is meddled with. It is saying, don't even get to the point of strife. Don't even get to the beginning of strife, because then you won't be able to find yourself in a place where you're able to be discerning and mutually benefit from the disagreement that you have. Now, I think the fundamental thing about strife is the anger associated with the disagreement, not necessarily just disagreement in and of itself. But that first exercise that we went through, which was sort of like a quasi-strife, again, just a disagreement, I think that still stands. I think that's still important for one to participate in, to be the discerning individual, to think of mutual benefit rather than of contention. We are warned here about the runaway nature of our heart. Again, leave off contention before it is meddled with. He that justifies the wicked, and he that contemns the just, even they both are abomination to the Lord. Oh, man. Again, it's one of these verses that on the surface, it's one of these things just like running or exercise in general. It just seems so simple, right? We can go out, we can go for a walk every day, after work or whatever. We could spend 30 minutes to an hour. But then also we are faced with that call of, well, how deeply do you want to be involved in this practice of yours? How well do you want to spend the time that you are engaging in this practice? And the call here for me, although I understand why the justification for the wicked, it is the elevation of a negative, and he that condemns the just, again, it is the bringing down of the superior, of the positive. It is understandable why this is an abomination to the Lord, but it does us nothing in terms of our conception of justice, of what is justifiable, of what is wicked, of what it means to condemn, or what it means to be just. And so, just like our example of exercise, that one ought to put forth a good effort if they're going to go at all, we ought to do the same here. And I should mention that, as a caveat, if it is indeed the case that we have high standards, but our standards are the very thing that prevent us from engaging in the level of activity or the level of discourse or the level of interpretation that we would like, then perhaps we have to remain humble and take a step back, or reevaluate. Perhaps it's not all that bad to go for a walk, something simple, until we are able to handle what the mind wishes to accomplish. So with that, what can we say of justify? So let's start in this way. If I am to show you something, what does that mean? In what way can I show you something? Well, in one instance, I can reveal something to you that would be otherwise unknown to you. I can draw your attention to an object. This revealing could be something of an idea, something in the conscious sphere that you had not thought of. I could demonstrate a procedure by which you can fix something or produce something. I can, along with the orientation of, or the direction of one's attention, I can allow or cause something to be visible. I can show you who I am. I can display an emotion. I could do something for you. I could also show you something in the manner in which I wish to prove something to you, to demonstrate the truth or existence of something by some evidence or some conceptualization, some argument. Now, in both cases here, to show and to prove, I am both illuminating, I am directing, I am offering evidence by which I wish to show that something is reasonable, that something is logical, that there is a pattern in the way that I am perceiving something. Now imagine if I took such effort, perhaps of the type that I mentioned about exercise or about some intellectual pursuit, and I drove all of that into wickedness. I drove all of that into the darkened nature. I focused on that specific aspect of man's fall. I took it into greatest consideration, and I wanted, out of my own ignorance, to expand that. And I want to give justification. Again, that process that we have just gone through by showing, by directing, by orienting, by offering evidence, so that I may find myself in a position of superiority. For manipulation, perhaps, to direct my own ends. Now there's two ways that this can be done. I think this could be done willfully, or it could be done out of pure ignorance. Now there is no innocence in either case, except in the one that recognizes it and offers it up, and accepts the rebuke. In such a case, that person is forgiven, but in the first instance of willful deception, he that justifies the wicked, this is that abomination. This is the thing that when we speak of the heart and that our little mechanistic friend on the interior, the adjuster that provides the various weights to the various feelings that ought to occur given a particular situation, given a particular context, given particular sensations, etc. The abomination should, if the adjuster is listening to the way, to the righteous path, he will have adjusted that part of our heart that causes us disgust or hatred at this justification for the wicked, for this falsehood, for the attempt at the subversion of one for the ends of one's own narcissistic desire, to perpetuate the fallen nature of man, to point at that unbelief, that relative experience of his, and say, well, everything is relative, nothing outside of my experience matters, there's nobody else that's going to be watching, there's no justice except for what I say that it is. Again, abomination. So now what of he that condemns the just? Is there anything more that we can say here that we haven't already said of he that justifies the wicked? Perhaps I won't say too much more about this condemnation of the just, but many times I've said that there are at least two common pathways by which somebody can condemn a just person. I think in the first instance, and in the backdrop of human frailty of understanding, frailty of mind, one man can convict another man that would be considered to be just by the ultimate standard, by way of misunderstanding on the part of the person that has done the condemnation. Their idea, their belief in what is just may be incorrect. Again, incorrect compared to that which actually is just. And in such a way, this person can condemn the just. Now there is the other way, the wicked or the evil way perhaps, in which somebody can find guilt in the very path by which a man chooses to do what is right or to do what is good. It's difficult to imagine, though, in the mind of man, that even in the case of the opposite, that is, a man that lives for injustice, let's say, does not consider his own way of thinking just. Certainly he would think it is just. But by way of severity and degree, this opposition to the truly good it comes forth. Now when I say that, I think of sort of the cultural contagion that is going around in the country at the moment. And how many people are, just as a disease infects a person, or a parasite infects a person, we seem to have this mind virus that is going around that tells people that what is just or what is true actually is evil, or it is maybe it's racist, or it's by virtue of it being traditional or old, thereby it is wrong. It's difficult to determine exactly what people bow down to these days, at least the people that are a-traditional. Certainly there have always been people that have existed and have found ways of being that have not believed in a transcendent source, or believed in the God that we have conceptualized through our various traditions. Nevertheless, given where we are, given the extent, the state of our societies, and given our extensive history of learning, of understanding ourselves and also the world, the material world, and of that which is beyond us, It is strange to me, and this is perhaps my own personal failure, that it is so difficult to determine one's intentions. Now, I do believe that by going through the practice of going through the Proverbs, of going through the Bible in a particular level of detail, that this becomes easier. It becomes easier to identify in myself, but also easy to identify in others. Both the things that ought to be changed, but also the things that are good about somebody, the things that ought to be recognized in every individual. For the interaction that focuses on the good will, by and large, turn out good. And undue justice, or undue judgment, I should say, on the part of one person to another usually doesn't end well. Wherefore is there a price in the hand of a fool to get wisdom, seeing he has no heart to it? We don't often see verses that end in a question, but here we have one. And what is being said here is somewhat of a warning. We can consider it a prompting, as all Proverbs are, but it is a rhetorical question to a degree. I see here deception, that of a man that offers something for a price that does not believe in what he is selling. Perhaps he does not believe that what he is selling is a good product, or in the case here of the traditional way of living, the righteous way of life, he offers to teach it at some price, but he has no inclination toward it. And of course, if one has no inclination toward something, how is one able to teach it? If they don't believe what they are doing, then certainly they don't believe what they are teaching. They may not be satisfied with what they do, their position as a teacher, perhaps, but that is not the same thing as the belief in what is being taught. A friend loves at all times, and a brother is born of adversity. A reflection on the nature of friendship, I think, is an interesting exercise. For I think it is it's strange when we consider one to be a friend versus an acquaintance. As we've been discussing boundaries in this episode, what can we say of the boundaries of friendship? What is the threshold that is necessary to be met in order for somebody to be a friend to another? Certainly it must be more than one thing. Perhaps we can distill it down to something specific. But here we see a friend that loves at all times. Love, as we have said before, can be a boundary in and of itself. It is the substance of boundary. And so what is within the boundary is dependent upon each party to sacrifice towards the other, to love the other at all times. And of this love, it means to be present, to offer advice in the best interest of the friend. To be interested in that person for the sake of that person, and not for some alternative gain. Surely something that is shared, or some commonality, strengthens the bonds of friendship. And I have been blessed to have good friends. Friends that I think, one friend in particular perhaps, that I have experienced many shared experiences. There has been adversity, perhaps not the same adversity, the same shared experience, but as we have lived our own lives, we have shared the struggle and the difficulties associated with various times of hardship. And through that mutual bonding, it certainly strengthens a friendship. A brotherhood begins to form. And it's interesting, it says born for adversity rather than born of adversity. That is, perhaps this is putting too much into it, but perhaps a useful reflection that something born for adversity, a relationship that develops to the point of wanting to share adversity together because both parties mutually understand the benefit of undergoing certain difficult experiences together. And the brotherhood, of course, is something of a relationship a level above and beyond that of a friendship. A more secure binding, we could say. A man void of understanding strikes hands and becomes surety in the presence of his friend. Now, I'll have to admit that this verse is not readily understandable to me. A man void of understanding strikes hands. Now, to strike hands, in one instance, I think means to make a deal with somebody, to shake on some agreement. The difficulty is a man that is void of understanding. Now surely we can understand a man void of understanding can make a deal, can strike hands with another. But then it says, becomes surety in the presence of his friend. Now perhaps this is suggesting an improper relationship or relation to his friend. And that this surety, this position of a guarantor, a sponsor, the person who takes responsibility for one's debt, perhaps this is not the behavior of a true friend. That is, someone who takes responsibility for the failures of one's friend, but rather it would seem to suggest that this is the incorrect way to go about something. That then a friend would counsel this friend not take the action to become the guarantor of this debt, perhaps that the friend holds, but rather to instruct the friend to uphold the promises that they had given. And the form of assistance that is offered is not in the sense that they undo the mistake that the friend had made, but rather to encourage the friend to understand the right way to resolve the situation. Surely this verse suggests something that is beyond that of mere risk, because there are many situations for which we think about risk that is, perhaps I should say potential risk in our decisions. But in matters of love and in matters of friendship, certainly there are types of risk. But the risk that comes financially, I think that this probably is something that is secondary. That surely it's not a zero in terms of value. But what is first is, I think, the guidance of the friend, or at least it ought to be first. Now, what makes the man that is in a position that guarantees this, or has this surety, I'm not exactly sure how to use that word, has surety with his friend, or for his friend, the lack of understanding is not his lack of understanding of the risk involved. That is, the risk of his friend not paying his debts. For surely a person that is friends with another person understands their capability, understands their financial situation, and to put themselves in such a position they understand the risk that they are involved in quite well. And perhaps it is improper because it reduces the friendship to a state of inferiority and one of superiority. That this financial obligation that the friend has paid off for the friend is now forever in limbo. Now the friend is in debt to the other friend. And this indebtedness is something of a, evil comes to mind, but that might be a bit much. It's imprudent, surely, indebtedness. They say that debt is an obligation, but I view it more as a lie. Indebtedness, again, it is an adjustment of one's relationship to the person that they are indebted to, surely. Reduces the person that is in debt to a degree of servitude. They are now obliged to pay their debt, perhaps with interest, so that there is some form of benefit to the person that is loaning the thing of value. But the initial insult occurs at the beginning, when the debt is taken out. What is being said, what is being offered, is on a degree of faith that the person that is asking will, in fact, repay that debt, will return that value at some point. But I have to wonder, at this type of arrangement, and that if a man ought not to, in his dealings, when he approaches something that he desires, perhaps something that he needs, to be a man of proper standing, he ought to make trades that he can make that he can pay, that he brings his own worth and value to the proposition such that he does not enter into that state of indebtedness. Of course, that's some ideal, and it's, I think, in this day and age, difficult to imagine what our society would look like without indebtedness. Virtually everybody is in debt to some degree, whether it's a car payment, a mortgage, a medical bill, a credit card bill, if I haven't said that already. Everything is beyond our means. And surely, when this mechanism gets out of hand, or when it just continues, perhaps we can say out of hand, just like an object rolling down a hill, it picks up velocity. And it's less likely to be stopped. The debt is less likely to be repaid. But as I've mentioned, again, I have to wonder about the initial condition, whether this is not immoral in and of itself to be in debt to another. But then again, if we can say that within that relationship, when somebody gives something of value to somebody else, and that something that is given is required some payment. And I can imagine a situation in which something that is given doesn't require payment. The love that is given by parents to children certainly comes to mind. The life that is given by a parent to a child, it doesn't require payment. It doesn't involve indebtedness. So surely giving doesn't involve this acceptance and then remuneration. But in those situations in which there is required payment for services rendered, if an individual is unable to afford the service that they desire, then perhaps the best thing would be to not accept the service, even if the person that is offering the service is offering it in such a way that would make it possible for the person to afford it over time. Or perhaps I'm mistaken. But either way, the surety in the presence of his friend I think that this situation, again, as I've mentioned, creating this mismatch for which the bond of friendship perhaps struggles to find its anchoring point because of one of superiority in the position of the friend that is in debt, perhaps to the friend that had made the promise to pay in the event of his inability to do so. He loves transgression, that loves strife, and he that exalts his gate seeks destruction. Now here's this word again, both transgression and strife. And surely this is not difficult to see, one that loves to cross boundaries or to transgress, loves the state of strife, that sort of passionate disagreement about the fundamental things, the very thing that serves to identify the boundary in the first place. The love is placed in the disillusion of that boundary, is not concerned about whether the boundary is correctly placed. It is concerned about the disruption of the boundary for the sake of disruption. There is a desire for variance. There's a desire for perhaps confusion. And the second half of this is quite interesting. He that exalts his gate seeks destruction. Now, what does it mean for somebody to have their own gate? Now, a gate is a form of a boundary. It is, we can call it a permeable boundary, perhaps, because when open, it allows flow. It allows we can call it a transgression, but perhaps that's too negative in context. There's a transmobility, we can say. And when it's closed, of course, that boundary is firm. Nothing can pass between it or beyond it. Now, the implication with that pronoun his is that there is a will involved with this boundary, that there is something innate in every single one of us as a part of our self-identity that has these permeable gates that we can open and close. And surely this is understandable to me. For everything that we've been saying about the mind and of the self involves multiple doors. Of the man that is selfish, he keeps the doors shut. And he only opens them because he feels that whatever is at the door serves his interest. And then he quickly shuts the door when whatever he desires has moved in. Now, the man of wisdom, the man of discernment, certainly keeps some doors closed, but always has some open, so that he may understand which doors he ought to keep closed and which he ought to keep open. The self is this continually evolving thing, depending on the context, the circumstance, but life experience, his relationship to God. All of this influences the self, what we choose to guard against and what we choose to let into our most intimate of spaces. Now, to exalt one's own gate, again, behind this gate, behind the wall, let's say, the city of the self, includes the important bits, the things that we value, the bits and pieces of the self that we recognize as ourself. It is the home of self. Now, what is a nation without the city? The city is in some sense the heart of a nation. The city of the self is in some sense the key aspect, the sort of the nucleus of the self-identity. Now, to exalt the gate, to put it above, to think of it as something that is precious to the point that they are able to think of their rank and their ability perhaps as superior to others, but that's not quite it. That's not quite sufficient. The exalting, again, this raising, the glorification, the meaning of high value. But of course it is high value of selfishness, of selfish desire. It is high value because of pride, because of one's perceived achievements. It is high value, again, with the eyes turned inward, turned within the gate, and not out of it. They choose not to recognize the value from without that may come into them and prop them up even higher, depending on what they choose to accept and what they choose to sacrifice. But rather their place, they attribute this all to their will. But it's not just will, because we can direct our will towards that which is without. We can direct our will to that which is truly meaningful. But rather, it is this glorification without the virtue of humility, without that part of the will that accepts one's own ignorance, and accepts one's own falsehood. But in what way do they seek destruction? Now perhaps this destruction is, in some sense, the result of selfishness. That is, one thinks of themselves as the king of the self, the king of reality, and that what is downstream of them is theirs for the taking. And that this view necessarily leads to destruction, because they have to destroy firmly held boundaries to get to the point where they are on top. Perhaps it is more intimate than that. Perhaps they seek destruction, an internal sort of destruction. Almost like a finite food source in which the individual rejects the possibility of resupplying that supply source, but instead wishes to feed on that which is within until it is completely exhausted. And the self, however it may, implodes in on itself. He that has a froward heart finds no good, and he that has a perverse tongue falleth into mischief. Another common word used in the Proverbs, froward, that this is something that is contrary, antagonistic. Now, of course, he that is of a froward heart, if the heart desires good, if the heart is antagonistic, they're going to look for something that is always to undermine that which is that which they are after. It's always this reductionism, all the way until something that, even if they desire it, even if it is something that, even if they want love and close relations, they pick apart their relationships because they are, and perhaps they feel that they are inherently imperfect, and it's that imperfection that ought to be weeded out. But in that process of weeding out, they destroy the relationship in the heat of their antagonism, and they find no good. And he that has a perverse tongue shall fall into mischief. Now, what does it mean to have, or perhaps we should say, what is perverse? And what is this mischief that one can fall down into from a place of superiority, of a higher place? Higher relative to what? Certainly higher in terms of standing, meaning, fulfillment, social position in life. Now, there is an aspect of perversion that is cultural, or how can we say, custom related. That there are established norms in the societies of man that one ought not to break. and that if one goes beyond them, they're considered perverse. There are age-old taboos in which if one engages in like a familial improper relationship, this is a perversion. This is a denial to cease one's behavior despite the consequences that could come. Whether this is an absolute law that one is breaking or one of custom, which could be a reflection of the absolute, surely. Now, a little bit about the etymology of the word mischief. Now, of the old French, the word mischief was spelled as meschief, or M-E-S-C-H-I-E-F, and it meant misfortune, or calamity, or an evil deed. Now, this Old French was a variety of the French language that was spoken from the 9th century to the 14th century. Now, of this, it was taken from the Latin. The Latin word misceo, M-I-S-C-E-O, which means I mix or I mingle. And it suggests the idea of things being mixed up or disturbed. Now that mixing up or that disturbing leads to misfortune. Now certainly a perversion is an inappropriate mixing. And the fall into this confusion, this mixture of things that ought to be separate, now this leads to misfortune in what way? What can we say of this? Of fortune, perhaps we could say something that is of favorable probability, perhaps unlikely probability, but still favorable, still good. When we think of fortune, we think of wealth, assets. Now, of course, the opposite end of that is a poor outcome. Probabilistically, a poor outcome. That the perversion of one is likely to lead to some poor outcome, some poverty of mind, of spirit, of wealth, whatever. It's a fall of a place of knowing to a place of insecurity, not knowing, a place of ignorance and darkness. He that begetteth a fool does it to his own sorrow, and the father of a fool has no joy. Certainly the creation of something that is lesser, something that is foolish, silliness, this lightness in the sense of how can we say, in terms of value, the begotten Son that is foolish, that doesn't necessarily consider their behavior, that is inattentive. This leads to sorrow. This leads to perhaps the regret of the father. The sorrow that perhaps the father that had raised that child, that had held that child, that defenseless child, I thought of all the possibilities for what could have occurred in that child's life. It seemingly had been brought to an end given the development of that child's foolishness. And that lack of joy, perhaps there was self-blame on the part of the father, at the events that unfolded that led the child to be and to develop into a fool, a person that has no care for the future, a wind that just sort of sweeps across the plain, leaving no trace of his existence, no root in the earth for which he can continue some line, continue his father's line. Imprudence, no care for the future, only care for the here and now, the selfish. So I think I'm going to end this episode here. We will continue next time with the rest of chapter 17. We'll be on verse 22. And we finish with verse 28. So we'll see how long that next episode is going to be.